Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Savitt. I'm happy to welcome you back to the Center for Security Policy webinar series. Remember, we do this every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. To check our schedule of upcoming events, go to securefreedom.org and check under the webinar tab. I'll also give you a preview at the end of this program. Today's webinar is entitled The Past, Present, and Future of Terror Finance Investigation, featuring our guest, Raymond Orzel, and moderated by my center colleague, Kyle Scheidler. Please note that you are in listen-only mode. You can submit your text questions in the Q&A box on the GoToWebinar panel, and I'll read as many questions as possible at the end of the program. This event is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/securefreedom, and on our website at securefreedom.org. With that, I'll hand it to the Center's Director and Senior Analyst for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, Kyle Scheidler.
Thank you, Adam. I'm really excited to introduce our audience to today's webinar speaker. Raymond Orzel is an expert in counterterrorism with a specialization in terrorism finance. He previously served as the inaugural director and executive co-chair of the Terrorist Financing Targeting Center, a presidential initiative at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. Prior to the Terrorist Financing Targeting Center, Raymond was a senior special agent with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, Homeland Security Investigations, and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. Perhaps most notable for our audience, Raymond served as part of Operation Green Quest, a Treasury investigation which exposed the role of suspected Muslim Brotherhood groups in terror finance in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. We are also very proud to say that Raymond is one of our newest senior fellows at the Center. Raymond, thank you, and thank you for your service and welcome.
Well, thank you, Kyle, and thank you, Adam. And I also want to thank Frank Gaffney and Fred Fleiss and everyone else at the Center for Security Policy. I've been familiar with CSP for some time, going back to my time on Capitol Hill as a senior fellow with the House Homeland Security Committee, serving Chairman Peter King, and then subsequently Chairman Michael McCall. Additionally, I've been worked with CSP during my time as a senior fellow on the House Foreign Affairs Committee under the leadership of Congressman Ed Royce. And so I'm very pleased to be here. And again, thank you all for the opportunity. And I just want to give a brief shout out because I believe my wife and her parents are also participating in this. And if it weren't, my wife is also a former government official, retiring with an honorable service of 25 years from the Department of Homeland Security. And if it were not for her and her support, I probably wouldn't be here speaking to you today, and certainly wouldn't have had the distinguished career that I've had. And then one other shout out I want to give is to my nephew Paulo. He is undergoing a procedure at the Cleveland Clinic this week. And so I want to send an acknowledgement of Paulo and thoughts and prayers for him as well.
We'll keep that in mind. And it's, as I said, we're really excited because the depth of the level of expertise that you bring to this topic is really needed at this time. And we're going to talk about the past, present, and future of terrorism finance. But let's start with the present and maybe leading into the future a little bit. Your last government assignment was as the executive director of the Terrorist Financing Targeting Center, which was a jointly chaired project between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia with participation from various Gulf cooperation countries. Now, most of us remember after 9/11 when Gulf state cooperation on terrorism finance was, let's say, limited at best, if not outright obstructionist in a lot of cases. And a lot of people, I think, still have that recollection in their minds. So in your experience, how has cooperation with Gulf states on terrorism finance changed over the past 2 decades? Are they taking terror finance more seriously?
The short answer is yes, absolutely. And I have the fortunate experience of shortly after 9/11, in about 2003-4, I was first sent to Saudi Arabia as a special agent with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division to participate as a member of a cadre of IRS special agents working on a task force, a joint task force on terrorism finance with the FBI, U.S. intelligence, and then Saudi law enforcement intelligence agencies. Part of our task back then was to help them set up a financial intelligence unit. Financial intelligence units are members of the Egmont group of financial intelligence units. And according to the Financial Action Task Force standards for countering illicit finance, terrorism finance, and money laundering, the establishment of a robust financial intelligence unit is an imperative step in that process. The Saudis did do that. I was actually there as part of a team training new officers within their Mobayith, which was at the time their internal security service, which I would liken at the time to kind of a hybrid FBI, Secret Service, IRS. They basically did everything. So back then, that's what our task was, and that task force worked very well with the Saudis. I'm not naive in that you could always say the cooperation could be better, but we made a lot of great strides back then, particularly at a time when there was a degree of distrust between our nations because obviously the number of 9/11 hijackers that were Saudi nationals. So fast forward to today, or even last year, when I became the executive director of the Terrorist Financing Targeting Center. Not only had the Saudis already established that financial intelligence unit, but they had also done a lot more. Including a hard push for the establishment of the Terrorist Financing Targeting Center itself. They were co-chairs of that. My counterpart was a general in the Saudi Ministry of Interior, and then he had a deputy that I worked with daily. So yes, I can say just from personal experience, from what I've seen, they have been active participants, willing participants, and to their credit, they have made great strides in countering terrorism because, as you all can remember, Osama bin Laden at one time turned his back on the royal family and he started targeting them. And some might say, well, yeah, they jumped on the bandwagon, when the attention of Al Qaeda, turned to them, not just the United States and Western countries. But again, bottom line is, from my experience, they have. And I'm proud to say that I had very good working relationships with not only the Saudis, but the other 5 Gulf Cooperation Council countries.
I mean, what did you find were the easiest points of cooperation? And then were there any notable points of contention over which groups or individuals should be the most important focus of the group or the center?
So during my tenure as the executive director of the TFTC, we had sanctioned or designated over 61 individuals and entities. And going through that process of designations, I mean, you're essentially getting 7 different countries, 7 government bureaucracies to agree to target specific individuals and entities every time we did a round or a tranche of designations. Keep in mind that with the establishment of the Terrorist Financing Targeting Center by former President Trump in May of 2017, during that time and shortly thereafter and subsequently, you had the ongoing Gulf Rift, the dispute between Qatar and its neighbors and GCC partners, Saudi Arabia, particularly Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and then additionally Egypt. Mm-hmm. So one of the proudest things I could say about the TFTC is, even though you had that ongoing rift, Qatar was a willing participant. Now, sometimes they had to be brought along, at the last minute to jump on board with the designations. But a lot of it is about relationship building. And anyone who's been in the Middle East knows that that is paramount to getting things done, is establishing good relations and rapport with your partners, so that if you're successful, you can keep the politics out of the mission at hand. And I'm proud to say that we were pretty successful at doing that within the TFTC. Some of the points of contention would be perhaps certain organizations in particular, to their credit, the Saudis and the Emiratis and Bahrainis, they've all designated the Muslim Brotherhood. We have tried to do so here in the United States, and I know personally from my time on Capitol Hill that there were efforts to lobby Congress to get that done. Unfortunately, it hasn't happened. But other instances, points of contention would be like Hamas or organizations of Palestinian Islamic Jihad related to, what was going on with respect to Israel. So, but the other thing is, there were certainly, terrorism transcends, it should transcend politics. And I think to a certain degree, we were successful in making that happen.
Speaking about the role of politics and terrorism, we've recently seen some moves by the Biden administration to reverse what the Trump administration achieved on terrorism designations. Most notably, I'm thinking here of their decision to reverse the designation against the Houthi rebel organization in Yemen. We have also achieved success with working with Gulf allies to designate a number of elements of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. And the Biden administration has made pretty clear that they're interested in relaxing sanctions in exchange for some kind of deal with the Iranians. And my question would be, how do you think, most particularly the Saudis, because of the role of the Houthis, but how do you think some of these Gulf states are viewing those reversals from the United States?
Well, I would say not just the Saudis, but also the Bahrainis and Emiratis. They were a pretty consistent coalition when it came to countering the IRGC and Iran and Hezbollah and the nefarious actors. Now, part of it might be religious, the Sunni versus Shia, but overall, they were a pretty consistent partnership when it came to countering the threat from Iran, particularly in the Gulf, in their own states. I think what's unfortunate about delisting the Sunnis is, the Houthis, is while I was in Riyadh and my wife was with me, the Houthis were lodging missile attacks from Yemen as far into Saudi Arabia as the diplomatic quarter in Riyadh. So by relaxing the sanctions against the Houthis, the question's going to come up is, well, is that going to give Iran, are they going to become more assertive through their proxy, the Houthis? And God forbid if something should happen where the Houthis then attack the diplomatic quarter in Riyadh, where not just the American embassy is, but all the other embassies. Almost all the other embassies are located there, not just the embassies, but the diplomatic housing, ambassadors, charge d'affaires, DCMs, etc., and then people like myself who are diplomats, my wife and I, and their families and children. So I think it's perhaps a little premature for them to do that without getting anything in return. I mean, let's remember, negotiation is a process. Just the definition of negotiation is, give and take. And right now, all indications from Iran are that they're not going to negotiate. They're not going to give up on their enrichment of uranium towards their goal of becoming a nuclear weapon country.
So let me ask you this. as it relates to, especially the U.S. removing some sanctions. And then also, you mentioned, and I think our audience really wants us to get into this topic, the Saudi and Emiratis being very aggressive in designating Brotherhood organizations, which the U.S. has not been willing to do. Does the designation of a group or an individual by other countries play a noticeable role in the way the U.S. decides to designate on terror finance? Is it helpful to us to have the Saudis and the Emiratis be forward-leaning on some of these groups in order to get the U.S. to take action?
Oh, it absolutely is. Just going through every round of designations we did within the scope of the TFTC, within that framework of that entity, it included discussions and then a vetting process. And it doesn't happen overnight, not by any stretch. So where we knew we could get agreement on certain individuals or entities, we would certainly be more proactive in pushing those, as long as it made sense to U.S. foreign policy, not just from a State Department, but also from a U.S. Treasury Department perspective. So, yes, it does make a difference. And if you had any one of the members of the TFTC, if they were more forward-leaning on certain subject entities or individuals, then that would certainly help the process. And it does have an impact or does influence U.S. decisions, but it is not always the ultimate or the final decision piece.
Sure. Let's talk a little bit about, because we're talking about now the Brotherhood's role in terror finance. And you can certainly see how some countries would point to specific individuals or specific organizations and say, these guys are clearly engaged in terror finance. And if it's on something like Hamas, maybe we get less response from the Gulf. But on things when it comes to do with funding ISIS or Al Qaeda, maybe you get a better response. And the same thing here in the United States, for that matter, where depending on where the money is going, a given country may have more or less interest in taking action against a specific entity. But you yourself were involved in cases where Brotherhood members or organizations were engaged in apparent support for terrorism, particularly in the aftermath of 9/11. I was wondering if you could just characterize for our audience what the Brotherhood's role is in supporting jihadist terrorism. In your sense, from your perspective, how do you feel that it works? And do you think has it changed at all since those days?
So I'll address the latter part first. As far as change, I have not seen examples of change. I think perhaps just like other individuals who are of interest to the government from either a law enforcement or intelligence standpoint, over time, people or organizations can tend to get more creative in the way they do things. For example, there have been reports recently that even Hezbollah is dabbing into cryptocurrency, and others may follow suit, ISIS, Al Qaeda. So as technological advances occur, they're going to take advantage of that, just like narcotics organizations, criminal gangs, MS-13, et cetera. They all operate very similarly in that regard. Going back to Operation Green Quest and some of the cases involving Brotherhood elements here in the United States, I'll refer to a prime example would be the Holy Land Foundation case, of which I had. It was related just to other cases that we are working. But the main argument that comes out of that is the same argument that we apply to money laundering statutes here in the United States, and it's the concept of fungibility. So, for example, in the Holy Land case, yeah, they're raising money, and I think to a certain extent, from what I recall, there was able to prove that money was going for very nefarious purposes. And that's what we essentially what we had after 9/11, or leading up to 9/11, was you had essentially reverse money laundering. You had good money going through mosques and charitable organizations towards purposes for illicit purposes, terrorism, and other activity. But the concept of fungibility is such that if you're providing, say, for example, money to Hamas, and they might have a cultural wing, a social wing, they still have a militant wing. So the whole fungibility concept, just like it applies in money laundering cases, is that, yeah, there might be money going for good here. So you might have Pablo Escobar giving money to poor people, but yet on the other hand, he's a narco-terrorist in Colombia. So that concept of fungibility is important because when you provide more money to, say, a perhaps noteworthy cause, a social side or a cultural side or something that helps the people, to a charity or an organization like Hamas, they still have a militant wing, and that frees up more resources for their militant activities, not just for Hamas, but this also applies to Hezbollah as well.
And I think people don't seem to understand that the way these terrorist organizations work, they need to do that social and political and ideological infrastructure building. They need to build those mosques, they need to build those schools and madrasas for their work. So if you give $1 for that, it's $1 they don't have to spend of their own money that they can spend on a tunnel or buying a bomb or building some kind of weapon and the like. So that is very important. And I think it's been a concept that is central to our effort to fight terror finance that has seen a great deal of pushback in the United States in recent years, where you have nonprofits and other organizations pushing back very aggressively, saying, it's not right to designate an organization if they are only funding charity work. And I think this has been somewhat effective. I mean, if you go back, the United States has not designated a U.S. charity for terrorism since 2009. That's my understanding. Before that, we designated U.S.-based charities fairly routinely because there's a lot of money in the United States and we move a lot of money overseas. But, is there an element where, this was central to our effort after 9/11? Is there an element of the U.S. bureaucracy that has forgotten this, or is there a great deal of pressure from outside organizations on the government not to target certain groups, not to engage in certain elements of investigation?
I think it's a combination of all the above. Certain investigations that I was a part of, with changes in administrations and that, and changes in views of the work that we were doing under GreenQuest, and then subsequently it started under Treasury and then moved over to Homeland Security when the U.S. Customs Service became Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So there's that, political pressure, and then you have organizations, charitable organizations that become very proactive in lobbying Congress. The Council on American Islamic Relations, they have, to their credit, they have lobbied Congress very effectively, and they've gotten the attention of members of Congress. Just from a physical standpoint, their offices are right down the street from the, couple of the House buildings right there on Capitol Hill. They provide interns to Capitol offices, members' offices, or committees. So there's that. But then the other part is the U.S. law enforcement intelligence has gotten better. I'm not naive. There are still turf wars and bureaucratic red tape that gets in the way, but there was a lot of attention on charities, and I think to our credit, law enforcement intelligence, drawing that attention to them made governments and administrations, not just here in the U.S., but in Saudi Arabia as well. I remember sitting in meetings with the Minister of Islamic and Religious Affairs back in 2004 and talking about, Al Haramain and the Muslim World League and, other organizations that, we had a lot of concern and there was evidence to show that, money, good money, into, coming through the mosque or the charities was then going towards nefarious purposes. And then finally, there has been more, I think, interaction and cooperation amongst the agencies. I know that during my time at Treasury, you have a lot more joint investigations, and that's attributable to the Joint Terrorism Task Force at the FBI, and then other initiatives like the one that I was a part of in Saudi Arabia. I have to excuse myself. The dog
Please.
is like, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, Raymond. And when you get back, I want to talk a little bit about how turf wars affected the early days. As I mentioned in our intro, you were a member of Operation Green Quest, which had some problems with turf wars over terrorism finance. There was sort of on the one hand, a whole of government effort to deal with terrorism. Right, it was right after 9/11, obviously, but then at the same time, there was still an effort by various agencies to sort of protect their rice bowl, so to speak. How did that affect terrorism finance, during that period, and then also how has it been overcome?
Well, to be quite frank, the turf wars are never going to go away, and oftentimes it boils down to individual personalities, the individual agents among various agencies. I'm proud to say that I've worked with some of the best at the CIA, the DIA, the NSA, the FBI, Homeland Security, IRS, DA, etc. You name it. But there are oftentimes personalities and just personal views that get in the way, and that's unfortunate. I think the fortunate part of this is, even though that doesn't sound good for America's national and homeland security, the good part of it is, at the end of the day, all the agencies as a whole and their leadership realize that we have to fight together, and we can't be fighting ourselves. And a lot of this was going on during the last administration. There were a lot of philosophical differences that were allowed to come out and affect and impact investigations. That is the greatest threat to law enforcement and intelligence and their ability to protect the homeland and our national security, is when you allow political ideology to step into the fray. Then you've taken away the independence and the objectivity of law enforcement agents and intelligence officers. Because all special agents in the government, whether you're the FBI, Homeland Security, IRS, FinCEN, you're fact finders. That's it. You don't make prejudgments. I mean, you're going to have, let's be honest, we all have, because of our personal legacies, our views, whether they're politically or personally. However, when it comes to investigations and intelligence operations, you have to let the evidence speak for itself. And I'm pleased to say that I feel that, especially given all the attention that there was during the last administration on some of the nefarious activities that were going on with various agencies, I think that there's a realization that, look, you have to put those things aside and let your evidence uncover the facts and speak for itself, whether it's a criminal investigation or a counterintelligence operation.
Well, I would think, especially in the world of terrorism finance, and really any money laundering or illicit finance investigation. I mean, I'm thinking of that old line from the HBO series The Wire, right? Which is, if you follow the money, you don't know what you're going to get, because, as we said, money is fungible. Everybody likes it. Everybody wants it. It goes to a lot of strange places sometimes, and it creates a lot of risk of politicization, because there will always be a temptation by political actors to encourage you to stop your investigation at the water's edge, before it reaches something that might be embarrassing to some government or some relationship or the like. And so I think understanding the nature of that and the importance of isolating investigators from that politicization is really important. Moving into the question of the future of terror finance, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, and you mentioned this a little bit with exploration of cryptocurrency, but I wanted to ask you, is the model of terrorism finance changing? I mean, my understanding, coming from 2003 through 2005, 6, you had the traditional sort of web of nonprofits and for-profits and charities, and they would move money around illicitly in order to layer where money was going, and then before finally putting it overseas to to some criminal or terrorist actor. But it was pretty low tech, right? Relatively low tech method. Is that changing at all? Or is that organizational structure still, at the end of the day, important?
Terrorism finance, just like criminal enterprises, narcotics organizations, organized crime organizations, their funding mechanisms are evolving. So with terrorism finance, essentially what you had, as I alluded to earlier, was reverse money laundering leading up to 9/11, and probably even for a short period thereafter, until we started cracking down on charities here in this country, but then also they did in other countries as well, as they realized that that was a threat that wasn't being fully addressed, and that was true, I believe, worldwide. You had a lot of countries, and I spent a lot of time overseas working with other countries subsequent to 9/11, looking at charitable organizations and how money was getting funded to Al Qaeda, not just by charities, but for-profit entities and their proprietors, their business leaders, individuals. So what you have now is they've actually started utilizing more traditional money laundering mechanisms. So money laundering is essentially taking proceeds from illicit or illegal activity, basically placing it, layering it, and integrating it into and through the financial system to make it look legitimate, to carry out your activities. So, for example, you might have, there have been cases where linked to Hezbollah, where used car sales will be going, from the U.S. over to West Africa, and then the proceeds making its way over to ultimately to Hezbollah strongholds in Lebanon and perhaps elsewhere, South America and the tri-border area, or even in Syria. Basically, so that's an evolution of the process. Now, some of the other areas to look at, and this, in the Sahel region of Africa, you've got organizations that are now terrorist or extremist type organizations or militant type organizations with an Islamist bent that are now going into regions of countries where the government doesn't have any control, and they're taking over gold mining activities. So that gold is then making its way through perhaps hubs in the Middle East and elsewhere, and that money, when these organizations get forced people, in some cases through forced labor, to mine that gold, to get it sold on the black market, and then it makes its way over into the international gold market. That's an area of concern. So it's another evolving part of terrorism financing. In Nigeria, there have been, and this happened in Syria with ISIS. They were stealing oil shipments and using oil sales to further their nefarious activities. And then now there have been reports of other organizations getting involved in cryptocurrency. But I'm happy to say that the U.S. certainly is starting to look closer at cryptocurrency. All the federal law enforcement organizations are, and then there are also our partners across the globe that are doing so as well, realizing that cryptocurrency presents another challenge. So countering the financing of terrorism will always be a war that we have to fight. It's just that the battlegrounds of CFT are changing in their form and structure.
Yeah, I mean, I think especially on the resource extraction side, I think, this really popped to the forefront with ISIS and its, the level of control it had over areas in Iraq and Syria. But it had been an issue prior to that with Hezbollah, with Hamas in Gaza, with the Taliban in Afghanistan, for example. Whenever terrorists have an ability to literally control space and the resources on that space, it really broadens what they're capable of in terms of financing, right? So you have all these other options for making a buck if you actually control the space. And I think we often lose track of that if we try to keep terrorism and insurgency and these sorts of things in separate buckets, rather than recognizing that really, like most terrorist organizations, have this desire to carve out this space for themselves where they can rule, where they can extract resources, where they can tax people. We saw that with ISIS as well, with the taxation systems and stuff. And we tend to forget that, I think, at our own peril.
Yes, and you bring up a good point about the tax, the zakat, as it's known in Islam. We even had cases involving coming out of Somalia, going through Europe and to the U.S., where individuals were raising money through the sale of khat. Khat is a plant, and it's similar to cocaine in that, or the cocoa plant, where they actually chew the leaves, and it causes, like marijuana, a sensation of feeling, drugged or something. But anyways, we had cases involving that, leading back when I was with Homeland Security Investigations. You had individuals from Somalia that were importing that here into the U.S., and we conducted a wide-ranging investigation all up and down the East Coast, from Washington, D.C. to New York, where they were importing this because that particular khat was actually illegal in the U.S., but it was not illegal in places like the U.K. and other European countries. But it was coming here, and the concern was that it's being, not necessarily here in the U.S., where they're actually supporting some actual cells or operations. We didn't have that evidence in this particular case. But the concern is it's coming from Somalia, where Al-Shabaab had a stronghold over there. And there were reports that they were charging a tax to the khat producers, much like the FARC was doing in Colombia, to the people there, the farmers, charging a tax and using those proceeds to help further their illicit activities.
Yeah, and so you can see how very quickly it can get muddled, where you have a criminal enterprise, but they're, are they paying a tax to the terrorist organization in order to fund their operation or to keep their operation running? And these things can be challenging, but they're important to emphasize. I would like to ask you, before we open things up for broader questions from the audience, what keeps you up at night in the space of terrorism finance? What are you worried about say, in the next 5 to 10 years?
You know, I would say one concern is Iran becoming nuclear. It just seems like, um, you know, there is a degree of fanaticism within their leadership and their of that country. Um, and then, so that would be a concern. Um, Overall, though, I would say a combination of the level. We need to see a better level of cooperation. I think not only domestically amongst our law enforcement intelligence organizations, but also internationally. Um, I from a and my concern about Iran is not necessarily them attacking us, but attacking, for example, Saudi Arabia. I mean, again, when my wife and I were there as diplomats, Iran was alleged to be, and I think it was proven that Iran was behind not only, you know, the support for the Houthis, but also attacks on the Saudi oil fields. That's a big concern because, you know, a war over there could easily turn into, you know, it may start as this little proxy, but my concern is that it could lead to something bigger.
Well, I mean, especially you're talking about a state that sponsors terrorism. They already feel like they can get away with quite a bit through their terrorist proxies. But if they're nuclear armed, the level of confidence they will have in their operations, I think, is a concerning. We didn't really have time to get into the question of state sponsorship overly much, but I mean, how does state sponsorship change the terror finance space? How does it make the investigation part more difficult?
Just from a resource standpoint, the state sponsors, the states themselves have far more resources available. They have the ability to use government entities, their financial sector, other economic sectors of their economy to help facilitate the financing of terrorism. And I think Iran being a perfect example of the way they get money to Hezbollah is probably a case in point, probably the most prominent of all cases there is. So that would be a concern that the state sponsors have more resources to their avail to make it harder for law enforcement intelligence to unravel and uncover the financing of terrorism.
Sure. So on that cheerful point, we'll bring back Adam Savitt, who will guide us through our audience questions. Hopefully we've picked up a decent number of questions from this group.
We got plenty. Let's see what we can get through here. The Biden administration seems intent only on destroying everything the Trump administration accomplished, especially as relates to Iran. Do you have any confidence they'll be swayed into admitting reality by the Saudis, UAE, Bahrain?
Can you repeat the last part of that question, Adam?
Do you think the Gulf Arabs will have any sway in convincing the Biden administration that Iran is a proper threat?
I hope so. Am I sure? No, I'm not sure. I hope so. You know, I mean, think about it. It's pretty remarkable that you've got a couple of Gulf states now that have peace agreements with Israel. I mean, go back to you know, the peace deal between the Israelis and Egypt back in the day, and I mean, it was a huge deal. And I would argue that these peace deals are of the same magnitude as that. I hope that the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Oman, Kuwait, I hope that you know, they'll be able to have influence with the administration and help ensure their continued safety and peace in the region, and basically put a kind of a checkpoint on Iran that, you know, your rhetoric is one thing, but when you start facilitating attacks on Saudi oil fields, Emirati oil tankers, ports in Oman, etc., you're crossing a line there.
How is the new obsession with white supremacy detracting from our ability to fight jihad financing?
I think that so I liken it to this. So there was a time when the KKK was a threat, a big threat here in the country, and I'm not denying that they may not still be. But what federal law enforcement did, particularly back in those days, the FBI, was they infiltrated that organization. And so there are methods and sources that are ongoing and used. They're tried and tested. And there's no doubt that those methods and sources are still being used today to infiltrate white supremacist groups. So I don't think that that threat is big enough to detract from the bigger picture of international terrorism. But unfortunately, it's something that has to be dealt with. But I think the organizations are well placed and well suited to handle that, in addition to the counterterrorism portfolio.
There are a couple of border questions, but basically, what opportunities does it raise, the fact that we have a relatively open border as far as terrorists entering and also money laundering?
Well, this is, we're pointing out, Raymond, your experience in immigration fraud as well. Can you talk a little bit about border, the issue of borders, the issue of immigration fraud when it comes to defeating terrorism?
Absolutely. So after 9/11, and let's go back to the 9/11 hijackers. This is a perfect example. A lot of them overstayed their visas. So at least in those instances, we had people that had at least gone through a legal process to come here. Now, with the open borders, and you saw recently the two Yemeni nationals, and there were previously some Iranian nationals that have come through. And we saw a lot of individuals coming from certain places in Africa and elsewhere when I was still with Homeland Security investigations. So the threat is real. And I'll say this, I had actually worked cases where you had, and again, we had the advantage that people had actually filed paperwork to come here. So there was a paper trail. With the open borders, there's no paper trail, especially if they're able to get safe passage in without being stopped by Customs and Border Protection, the Border Patrol, or other authorities. They can, find their way into the United States and go into certain communities where they'll have cover, and you won't know they're there. That's the real threat to the open borders, is a lack of paper trail, and you don't know who's coming in unless you actually catch them. So they caught a couple of Yemenis and some Iranians recently. How many others have gotten through?
And I think also when you add to that the Biden administration's at least floating the idea of limiting or reassigning people doing internal immigration investigation and internal enforcement, which is something of a bugaboo for them, that they get a lot of pressure on their left from ICE investigations and cracking down on overstays and these sorts of things that you mentioned. So definitely a concerning issue.
Oh, absolutely, and it always will be. And during my time with Homeland Security investigations at ICE, I actually prosecuted individuals, including immigration attorneys, through court convictions for basically conspiring with business owners and others to get people here for nefarious purposes. And so that was one case. It was a big success. because there had been an interest in that particular individual for some time, because it had become known through sources and information and methods that that individual, and again, an attorney, an immigration attorney, was conducting nefarious activities to bring some unsavory people into the United States.
Would a full pullout from Afghanistan facilitate poppy-based financing in that region?
So I do know that I actually have a personal friend who's serving there now in an illicit finance capacity. A former colleague I worked with actually was my supervisor at one time. So I think if, you know, if there is, we're allowed to keep people in place that that can help the Afghanis who want, you know, their government. If they truly want to change, they have to tackle illicit finance just like every other country. They have to try to get to a point where they're going to um, become proficient, or at least on par with financial action task force standards, anti-money laundering regimes, countering the financing of terrorism regimes. I think without the military support and having military on the ground, that any American contractors that are there, you know, it's going to become more difficult, obviously, for them to operate in theater. And the question will be, well, if DOD pulls out, are we going to have those folks on the ground there that are actually trying to help the Afghanis, you know, the good citizens of Afghanistan and their government officials who want to see change and bring that economy into the 21st century?
Do you have any concerns, Raymond, that in cases where we have these military deployments like Afghanistan or Iraq, for example, that we don't hold them to the same standards on some of these illicit financing issues that we would hold other countries to, because we feel like we need their cooperation militarily or for other things?
It's always a balancing act. I can tell you where I've been on deployments overseas, and I've actually had attorney generals of countries, partners, yell at me personally because, you know, they felt that they weren't getting the cooperation they needed from U.S. authorities. I also had a minister of Interior or Finance in the Middle East do the same thing, because our State Department wasn't giving them something they wanted, even though at the time I was a Treasury agent. So, I mean, it is a balancing act. You know, in a perfect world, see, one of the things I always said as the executive director of the TFTC, look, you know, the Saudis are co-chairs, they're equal partners. So I made sure that my colleagues from Saudi Arabia, not just Saudi Arabia, but all the GCC countries, knew where I stood, and that one of the things we really have to be careful too is that we're not pushing too hard. You know, where we're telling them, well, you have to do this, you have to do this. This is where the diplomacy and the rapport building comes to play, where you can get them to come on board. Because I can tell you personally, there were a few occasions where we had partners that were not willing in some of the designations and sanctions we were going to propose within the TFTC, who were holdouts. And just through dialogue and it would be sometimes political pressure or diplomatic pressure coming at a level beyond my pay grade at the time, at the SES level, or even in political appointee level, where you know, that would have to happen to help bring them overboard. But what was great was, in the end, I would be the one that people would contact, as opposed to, you know, other personnel that are in country for the U.S. government. They would contact me directly and say, you know, some cases literally at the 11th hour, the night before Secretary Mnuchin was going to announce the designations, I would get calls from my partner saying, hey, just letting you know we're going to be on board, so you can count on us. And then we would go ahead and confirm that through other channels as well, just to make sure that what they were telling us is true. So it's always a challenge, and in certain countries it's more challenging than the others. But I can say just from my experience in the Middle East and the Gulf, there were definitely willing partners along the way.
Unfortunately, that'll have to be the last question. Kyle, if you had some closing remarks, and then I'll just do some announcements.
Sure. Well, I just want to thank Raymond again for taking time out of his day today to talk to us about this. And I'm looking forward to hosting Raymond again at the center website. He's really, as you have all seen today, just a depth of knowledge and a real research source on how terror finance works and how to counter it. So do look for more from him at the Center for Security Policy in the future. Raymond, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kyle, and thank you, Adam, and thank you everyone else who's participated, whom I can't see. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks. So our upcoming events, next Wednesday, the 14th, I'll be moderating our April China webinar, which will be on China's quest for space hegemony with our guest, Rick Fisher. The following week, the 21st, will be a webinar on artificial intelligence strategy with former Congressman Joe Sestak, moderated by our John Rosamondo. We're very thankful for your viewership today. Remember, the Center's work is only possible because of your generous support. If you do enjoy these weekly programs as much as I do, please visit our website, securefreedom.org. Click on the big red donate button in the upper right corner, where you can make an instant contribution by credit card or get information about other methods of giving. Thanks again to Raymond Orzel, and we'll see everyone next Wednesday, 1 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you.